Canada Post just got a $673 million lifeline from the federal government on May 8, 2026. That sounds like a lot, right? But what if I told you the real cost to Canadian taxpayers for keeping this crown corporation afloat is already nearly double that, pushing towards $1 billion this year alone? The truth is, Canada Post was burning through a massive $1 billion loan and was set to run out of cash by the end of 2026. This new bailout isn't just about covering operational costs, it's a critical lesson in how government intervention can reshape a struggling industry, and what it ultimately means for our wallets. We'll walk through the actual numbers, explain where that money is really going, and by the end, you'll see exactly why the true cost of these bailouts is often buried much deeper than the headlines suggest, and it's a number that hits every single one of us. A 2026 government bailout of Canada Post just committed $673 million to keep the lights on, but what many don't realize is that this isn't just a one-off payment, it's a rollover from a previous $1 billion loan that the Crown Corporation was reportedly burning through, facing a complete cash crunch by year-end. This isn't just about sending letters, it's about a critical lesson in how government spending actually works, and often, how it costs us more than the headlines suggest. In this video, we're going to break down the real cost of saving Canada Post, tracing the money trail from the initial $1 billion top-up all the way to this new $673 million injection authorized on May 8, 2026. We'll look at the hidden taxes and economic ripples that affect someone in your situation, even if you rarely use the mail. We'll examine the financial tightrope Canada Post has been walking for years and compare it to other historical government interventions. The lesson here is to look beyond the announced figure and understand the broader economic impact. The most alarming statistic, perhaps even more so than the quarterly deficits, was the revelation that Canada Post had, in just 2 years, nearly exhausted a $1 billion line of credit extended by the federal government. Globalnews.ca, citing internal documents and anonymous sources, detailed this rapid depletion, suggesting the Crown Corporation was on a silent countdown to insolvency, facing a potential cash shortfall by the end of 2026. This wasn't a sudden storm, the financial indicators had been worsening for years, like a slow-motion train wreck. In 2022, Canada Post reported a staggering $548 million loss before tax, a figure that then spiraled to an even more dire $748 million in 2023. That's an escalation of nearly $250 million in losses in a single fiscal year, a trajectory that was not only negative but rapidly accelerating. By the close of Q3 2024, year-to-date losses from operations had already soared to an unprecedented $803 million, indicating a deep-seated financial crisis. Fast forward to early 2026, and the trend continued unabated. The first 3 months of that year alone brought an announcement of another $205 million loss. This grim update, ironically, coincided with a critical vote on a new collective agreement by the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, CUPW, adding immense pressure and uncertainty. Veteran financial journalist Stuart Duncan, in his column on May 31, 2026, didn't mince words, bluntly describing the situation as utter chaos at Canada Post. The undeniable lesson from this escalating financial hemorrhage is clear. Sustained and accelerating losses invariably point to deep, systemic issues that no amount of one-time cash injections or governmental lifelines can permanently fix. The question loomed large. Was the insolvent truth that the billion-dollar lifeline had already vanished into the abyss? But what if I told you that billion-dollar lifeline was already effectively gone? In an August 2, 2025, article, the C.D. Howe Institute, a prominent think tank, had already declared Canada Post effectively insolvent. Les Viner, the author, explicitly stated Canada Post would have run out of cash had the government not recently extended a $1 billion lifeline, confirming this initial $1 billion loan was an earlier measure, not the most recent May 2026 bailout. This means that by early 2026, Canada Post had effectively burned through that first $1 billion injection, setting the stage for the next crisis, the one we just heard about. Think about it like this. Imagine a friend who borrows $1,000 from you in January, promises to pay it back, but by June they're back, asking for another $600 because the first $1,000 is completely gone. That's essentially what played out with Canada Post. Yet, in the government's own Spring Economic Update 2026, titled Our Plan, Canada Strong for All, which focused on cutting $60 billion over 5 years from government operations, there was no public acknowledgement of Canada Post's specific, rapidly unfolding crisis. This left many observers wondering if there was an attempt to manage public perception, trying to avoid publicizing the Crown Corporation's struggles while talking about broader austerity. The lesson here is that sometimes the most significant financial issues are the ones not explicitly addressed in public statements, requiring us to connect the dots from different sources. And this wasn't the only move that raised questions about transparency. But how did the government pull off a nearly billion-dollar financial commitment without a major public spectacle? On May 8, 2026, the federal government announced a cabinet order authorizing up to $673 million for Canada Post. Now, this wasn't just some new money out of thin air. This sum was explicitly for meeting operating demands through next March, meaning roughly March 2027, painting it as a clear stopgap measure. The interesting part, though, is that this $673 million was actually carried over from a roughly $1 billion top-up authorized earlier, implying a reallocation or an extension of a previous, less publicized funding mechanism. Think of it like this. The government had already set aside a bigger pot of money, and this was just them dipping into it again, but with a different label. The crucial maneuver here was the use of a cabinet order. This bypassed the need for a full parliamentary vote or a detailed public debate, allowing the government to act swiftly and with less scrutiny. It's a mechanism that gives the executive branch power to implement decisions without going through the entire legislative process. This approach allowed Canada Post to dodge collapse by securing funds without a major public spectacle, despite the institution's dire state. The lesson here is that sometimes significant financial decisions, especially for Crown corporations, can be made through administrative channels, effectively keeping them out of the direct glare of parliamentary debate and public opposition. The real price of dodging collapse isn't just the dollar amount, it's the lack of transparency in the process. But here's the most surprising part about Canada Post dodging collapse: the actual price tag. We've heard about the initial billion-dollar Lifeline before 2026, and then that $673 million cabinet order in May 2026. If you add those up, we're talking about nearly $1.7 billion in recent financial support. Now, why is that surprising? Because this massive cash injection happened at the exact same time the government was trying to save Canadian taxpayers $60 billion over 5 years by reducing other government operations spending, according to their Spring Economic Update 2026. It's a bit like someone declaring they're going on a strict budget, only to then buy a new, very expensive car. Les Viner, from the C.D. Howe Institute, pointed to these deeper, systemic issues in his August 2, 2025 article, Canada Post is a case study in Canadian dysfunctionality. He highlighted that this bailout wasn't just about covering a temporary cash crunch. This was about preventing the outright failure of a crucial Crown corporation, one responsible for mail service across the country and thousands of jobs. The public nature of the billion-dollar bailout title might suggest widespread knowledge, but the government's quiet cabinet order for $673 million suggests a careful effort to manage the perception of such a large expenditure. The lesson here is that sometimes, the true cost of avoiding a crisis is far more than the initial headlines suggest, especially when other priorities are in play. But Canada Post's collapse was just the beginning of the problem. But here's the kicker. That nearly $1.7 billion bailout wasn't a fix, it was a band-aid on a gaping wound. This massive cash injection did absolutely nothing to address the core problem, as evidenced by Canada Post's spiraling losses. $548 million in 2022, a staggering $748 million in 2023, and by Q3 2024, year-to-date losses from operations had already hit $803 million. Les Viner, from the C.D. Howe Institute, wasn't mincing words when he called Canada Post a case study in Canadian dysfunctionality in his August 2, 2025, article. He's hinting that the problem is deeply embedded in their operational model or even their governance. Think of it like this. Imagine your friend keeps asking you for money to fix their car, but they never actually take it to the mechanic, they just buy more gas. That's what these repeated lifelines and top-ups, the initial $1 billion, then the $673 million, tell us. It points to an unsustainable business model, not just a one-off crisis. What's even more eyebrow-raising is the government's Spring Economic Update 2026, where they trumpeted saving taxpayers $60 billion over 5 years by cutting other spending. Meanwhile, they're silently funneling nearly $1.7 billion into Canada Post with barely a peep. It highlights a real disconnect in their broader economic strategy, potentially leaving taxpayers on the hook for future bailouts. And to add fuel to the fire, these Q3 2024 losses actually preceded a major labor dispute, indicating internal challenges far beyond declining mail volume. As commentators like Stu described it, the situation was utter chaos. The lesson here is that financial injections without fundamental change are just delaying the inevitable. What this whole scenario really shows us is that the nearly $1.7 billion in government financial support wasn't some long-term strategy, it was an emergency tourniquet. The lesson here is that when a crown corporation like Canada Post consistently posts massive operating losses, like $803 million by Q3 2024 alone, the problem isn't a lack of cash, it's a fundamental issue with their business model. This means that while the immediate collapse was avoided in 2026, the underlying financial pressure on taxpayers is only growing, largely out of the public eye. Have you ever seen a major government service get quietly propped up like this, only for the true costs to surface later? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to understand the true cost of these kinds of financial maneuvers, make sure you subscribe, because we break down the hidden numbers every week. Next, you'll want to watch my video where I explain how the Bank of Canada's balance sheet impacts everyday Canadians. You might be surprised by the connections.